Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Stephen McNulty. I'm the Growth Officer at Haventec, and I will be your moderator today. It's a pleasure to welcome you and thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to be with us this morning. We have a tremendous agenda for you today. We will be offering actionable insights on passwordless authentication, a technology that truly is at the intersection of security, privacy, and user experience. We will cover the need to move beyond passwords and the trends supporting the adoption of passwordless authentication, opportunities that passwordless authentication can create for you and for your organizations, and taking the first steps on that passwordless journey and the pitfalls to avoid. If you would like to ask questions during the session, please use the question panel at any time. We will collate those and pick through them at the end of the session, depending on time. We will take as many questions as we can. Okay, let's get started by introducing Haventec and today's speakers. So, Haventec is a digital privacy company that has developed and validated Authenticate, a globally patented platform that stops passwords from being stolen. Authenticate is a single-step authentication solution that is substantially more secure than multi-factor authentication and provides a seamless experience that is exceedingly simple to use. Now, with that being said, you will learn more about what we do and why we do it through the course of the next hour. But for now, let's introduce our panelists. And let's start with Mark Anderson. Our first guest is the National Security Officer from Microsoft Australia. Mark has over 25 years experience in the IT industry, with 16 of those at Microsoft in various roles across the globe. At Microsoft Australia, Mark is currently responsible for working with partners, customers, government departments, and industry regulators to ensure that the Microsoft platforms are not only understood by policymakers and citizens, but also adhere to security compliance and risk management requirements. In addition, Mark is accountable for the protected level assessment of Azure, Microsoft 365, and Dynamics. So welcome, Mark. We have another guest today that wasn't on our information, but we're very, very pleased and excited to have John Jones with us here today. John is a partner at Deloitte with over 30 years of experience in the IT industry in both Australia and the United Kingdom. He's a well-known digital identity community member and having previously founded Qubit Consulting, a consultancy specializing in the design and delivery of digital identity solutions. Prior to Qubit, John was the Australia and New Zealand software CTO for Sun Microsystems. And in this role, John acted as a media spokesperson, as well as a presenter and the creator of multiple technology articles and IP. Prior to Sun, John spanned a number of architecture leadership roles, primarily focused in enterprise integration. It's wonderful to have John with us today to give a perspective from Deloitte. And finally, I'd like to introduce Dave Monsell. Dave is Haventec's CEO, and he has a strong affinity for technology and a keen business sense for emerging solutions. And prior to Haventec, Dave spent 20 years at Accenture, where he occupied a number of geographical leadership, account management, and delivery leadership roles, including the managing director for Accenture Digital, inclusion and diversity lead, capital markets lead, and was the client leadership role for a number of Accenture's leading financial services clients. Prior to that, Dave spent 5 years at the Australian Stock Exchange in several roles, including the Internet and Information Security lead. So that is an esteemed panel, and we will have a number of questions. We will also invite you all to respond to a few polls that we think are pertinent and interesting to the topic. And with that, we will get started. So let me start with you, Mark. Why do we need to move beyond passwords? What is the urgency driving this situation?
Yeah, thanks, Stephen, and good morning to everybody that's joined us. Yeah, when you think about it from a password perspective, there aren't many technologies that are still in use today that are actually 6 decades old and have remained relatively, unchanged in that time. But passwords are one of them. It was actually back in 1961 when they were initially developed as a way of protecting individual accounts when time sharing on those big old monolithic computers of the day. And that idea of a username and password combination as a security control still strongly persists today. In fact, I'd say the majority of the folks listening right now, you've used that mechanism probably at least once today already. And when you think about it, when we talk about how do we increase the security of passwords from a control perspective, and I'm not talking about additional controls that supplement passwords, but the passwords themselves, there's only really one way to increase the security of passwords, and that is through increasing things like complexity and length. And the more you increase complexity and length, the harder they become from a human standpoint to remember. So as security increases, usability then ultimately decreases as a result. And we all know the story of once people get to the point where they can no longer remember their passwords anymore, they start writing them down on Post-it notes and putting them on monitors or under keyboards and so forth. We all know those stories. So all of a sudden, as the paradox is, as you increase the security of the password, the actual usability aspect of them, the way people treat them, actually decreases the security of them. In addition, I'd say that when you increase complexity and do things like force no reuse of passwords to say 45-day or 60-day expiration, you then end up with folks forgetting their passwords on a regular basis. And I remember a study, it's probably about 3 years old now, if I remember rightly, from Forrester, I think back in 2018, when they did the total economic impact study for Office 365, so from a Microsoft standpoint, and their results came out and said about 25% of all help desk calls were actually related to password resets, which is staggering when you think about it. It's pretty much a quarter of your help desk time taken up on having to reset these things. Now you can talk about things like self-service password reset and so forth, but ultimately you are just band-aiding a problem for a security control that we do really need to move past.
And Dave, maybe you could expand a little bit on the usability side of passwords.
Well, what do we know? What's the data telling us around the use of passwords? We know that customers want, you would argue, really like convenience. I get that from a couple of data points. Piece of research Microsoft did a couple of years ago that 60% of users were reusing their passwords, as well as the fact that we are seeing, certainly talking to our clients and then the market more broadly, a general accelerated uptake of passwordless authentication experiences. We also know that digital privacy is a key concern for Australian citizens. Last year's survey on the Australian community attitudes to privacy by the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner is a really timely, and thorough reminder of that point. But we also know that current technologies are providing inadequate protection to centrally stored information. So the data point from a bit of research that ForgeRock did last year that a staggering 450% of attacks involved stolen username and passwords, and this was a 450% increase from 2019 to 2020. And in a piece of research that Verizon did, 81% of data breaches were caused by compromised, weak, and reused passwords. This research also highlighted that current technology solutions that included two-factor authentication, eye, facial, and fingerprint were ultimately not mitigating the theft of critical value data, and then ultimately we're not protecting our privacy. So Why do I think? You know, we need to focus on this. Our customers are telling us they want a more convenient solution. They're telling us that privacy is important, and we're also getting enough data from breaches that are occurring across the globe that the means by which we go about certainly protecting this information is not providing the protections we all expect.
Thanks, Dave. And John, maybe it might be interesting to hear Deloitte's perspective on this, because I assume that this is something that you would be talking to your clients about pretty regularly in your role as identity lead.
It is indeed, yeah. Thanks, Stephen. Danger artifacts coming third in this list is that that a lot of these questions are already answered competently by Mark and David anyway, but I'll see if we can add some color into this equation. I mean, obviously, as Mike mentioned, the passwords have been around for years and years and years. The difference is that when I first set out in computing, you know, you had to physically get to your desk within a building to access your computer. So it had that bricks and mortar kind of protection anyway, but obviously things have changed dramatically over many, many years. And with the advent of COVID, it's really pushed the boundaries even further for knowledge workers in particular. So I think the sensitivity around password usage has been heightened through what's happened over the last year and a half for sure. The reaction that people have had is to just slap on MFA on top of the existing systems. A lot of organizations have attempted to do that and then suffered badly from a backlash from the user community. This is more on the workforce side than customers probably, but we can talk more about this later, I'm sure. But there are challenges in just slapping on extra layers of security for sure. But it is a problem that's been around for a long time. I think we discussed amongst ourselves prior to this call that the fact that while organizations have introduced password policies, there are certainly there's vendors out there. I talked to one yesterday who, you know, have this notion of running effectively a hacker in a box that checks against all your password hashes within an organization. I think for a lot of people, despite the fact that they believe they have reasonably good password policies in place, when they actually run these algorithms over what they have, literally over a few minutes over millions of passwords, they uncover a whole host of extremely weak passwords. So the policy-based approach isn't working that well either. So yeah, it's obviously time to change. I think the challenge people have, and Mark mentioned this as well, is that in trying to boost the security, you end up you know, impairing the user experience, and that's particularly important from the customer perspective as well, because you're in danger of losing customers. So yeah, it's a really big challenge. I think just getting that sweet spot right in terms of the appropriate level of authentication and authorization for the assets you're trying to access is a difficult thing to do. Passwords certainly aren't helping.
Thank you, John. And so, reading between the lines of what the three of you were just talking about, there are clearly some underlying trends that are moving the dial on this increasingly. So I think it'd be worth expanding on those. So maybe Mark, we might start with Microsoft's perspective on that.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So I'd probably say, even just before we even get to the the context of how we've approached it, I'd say first of all, expectations as users and consumers. I don't know about you, but I expect ease of use from my technology these days. So whether if you use a phone, like I'm an iPhone user, I use facial recognition for everything. I've got to the point now where I expect that point of friction of having to type in codes and so forth to have disappeared. And interestingly, I think we used to, back in the day, we always used to go into the office to use the latest hardware and technology and capabilities because businesses were the only ones that could afford that tech. It's almost like over the past few years we've flipped, and all of a sudden all the great technology and the ease of use of technology is all at home, and businesses are still trying to catch up. So you end up with that sort of weird imbalance. But if I take an example of how we at Microsoft have approached it, so from an internal business to enterprise user perspective, we've been on this journey for a little while now, and we've actually broke it down into 4 discrete steps. Well, not steps as such, probably more like sprints and visions, if you like, so 4 different areas that we have to go through. The first was about actually enabling our field to have the capabilities for password replacement offerings. And in our case, that was, we were heavy on things like biometrics. So probably most people have heard of things like Windows Hello and the fact you can use your face or fingerprint or other biometric style capabilities. So number 1 was making sure that people had the pieces of technology that could do that. The second step was to then reduce the visible password surface area. So passwords at this point are still there, but how do we remove them from our users so that if they ever get to a point where they see a password dialog box pop up, that's unusual. We need to move to a world where actually seeing a password pop up is unusual. So we're not even necessarily talking about passwordless technologies right now. We're now talking about ensuring that your single sign-on type infrastructure throughout your organization is in place. Do you have SSO correctly operating in your environment such that your credentials can seamlessly move between those various applications? So step 1, get the offerings out there that people can use. Step 2, reduce that password area to reduce the muscle memory of typing in passwords. And then the third part, once we've got to that, from a user perspective, they're pretty much at this point not seeing or having to use a password, is to then, how do we get that in the end-to-end cycle? So the third part for us was, how do we move to a transition to a passwordless deployment mechanism? So even today, if I get it, the way we've moved our technology now, if I break my laptop now, I could literally just walk over the road, go to my JB Hi-Fi, Harvey Norman, wherever, grab a laptop, as long as it's got a TPM in it, I can just log in, my username and password and my mobile phone, and I build my new laptop. But how do we move? Again, we're still having to use passwords. So how do we get to a passwordless deployment mechanism? And once we've done that, we call that's the point where we've achieved what we call the end user promise. From an end user perspective, they don't get to see passwords anymore. Interestingly, as a side note, as we've moved on this journey, while we still have passwords, for example, we've changed our password policy from a point of view of how often you have to change your password to 1 year. It used to be every 45 or 60 days, but now it's like every year. And then the fourth step, which is a really difficult one from our perspective when you think about the amount of legacy that sits in terms of password, and that is to eliminate passwords ultimately from your identity directory all up. So that the entity of a password doesn't exist in your identity directory. And once we've got to that point, that's when we see ourselves as achieving that security promise. So end of step 3 is achieving the user promise, end of step 4 is the achieving the security promise. But that's quite difficult from a point of view on our perspective when you look at something like AD as an example, which is permeates through pretty much every part of an organization, and there's still a lot of legacy that relies on the password control mechanism.
That idea of the user promise and the security promise, Dave, I mean, I think the security promise is the premise by which we built the Haventec business. It might be worth you expanding on that concept for our attendees.
Well, thank you, Stephen. Not only the user or the end user of the solution, but also I want to also bring in a little bit of the perspective of regulation as well. We believe that all of the core digital stakeholders, consumers, Mark has talked a fair bit about enterprises there, but also regulators. That we're all seeking a solution to what are ultimately the inherent weaknesses and inconveniences of the current digital authentication model. Now, carrot and stick, we certainly are seeing, and certainly here in the Australian marketplace as well as international jurisdictions, an increase in regulation by sanction for breach, whether it's GDPR in Europe, CCPA and what will replace it in California, even CPS 234 here in the Australian marketplace. What we're seeing are regulators introducing increased penalties, arguably as a response to the point I made previously that existing technology solutions and practices do not provide the intended protections. But I would argue that they're more responding to the need and responding to circumstances that we're all facing into. But who's driving this? I'm with Mark. Enterprises are. We're seeing fantastic innovations occurring from enterprises that are driving transformation in this space, as well as customer expectations. Let me talk about customer expectations. We're seeing leading digital businesses redefining and transforming customer expectations. And I'm going to take one of our clients, 86400, as an example. They offer passwordless multi-factor authentication for all of their customers. And these customers simply need to enter a 4-digit PIN or a biometric scan to complete their authentication. And they are being rewarded with market-leading customer satisfaction scores for their sector here in the Australian marketplace. So we know that not only customers like it, but the businesses that offer digital experiences, simple, convenient, relevant digital experiences to their customers have been rewarded by market-leading customer satisfaction scores. But then back to the business itself, it's quite simply great for business. The case for simple, convenient, private, accessible authentication is strong. According to the W3C, it's estimated that complex authentication can discriminate against up to 13% of the population. Now, another way of looking at this point, if you can provide accessible digital experiences supported by simple and convenient digital authentication solutions, you have the ability to reach 15% more of the market. And that's great for business.
And John, with your client mix, what are you seeing your clients doing in terms of responding to these trends?
It varies, depending on the sector. I think the other thing that we need to bear in mind is there are people who access services competently every day through mobile applications. There's certainly opportunities to reduce friction and remove passwords out of that cycle for sure. There's also an area which people often forget about, which is those services that are rarely accessed. So it could be insurance or government services or other sorts of services where people frequently, this is my experience with my family and others, will forget what they use. There'll be a variation of whatever they, cat's pet name is or something, but it'll be a combination that fails because they last accessed it a year ago. That's a whole other area. The other area that's allied to that is just the accessibility side of things as well. I mean, there are a large proportion of the community that are not necessarily that tech savvy and a challenge either accessing the devices themselves or simply challenge remembering what on earth they used as a username or password previously. So when we do strategy work or implementation work, it really depends on the client. There's certainly a variety of different challenges out there. And high expectations. I mean, the higher ed community, university sector is an example where, the student community has pretty high expectations of what the user experience is going to be at the universities. Universities don't necessarily have the kind of budgets of the staff, smaller ones certainly, to introduce new technology, on a minute-by-minute basis, but they have a community that has pretty high expectations of the experience themselves. So they have a strong focus. A number of the ones we've worked with recently have a strong focus to improve that user experience to meet the needs. So it does vary considerably, I think. The other thing, Stephen, to mention is, depending on whether or not you're talking about customer or workforce, those topics are dealt with differently as well. And we maybe can delve into that a bit later, but there's obviously the commercial trade-off on the customer side if you don't get it right. On the workforce side, we see a lot of clients who have in the workforce a resistance to using their own devices for MFA as well. So that's another dimension to the problem that's often kind of forgotten about. There's a distrust even within a community, within cyber at Deloitte. There are certainly people that don't have, device management software on their devices. Despite the fact that we've got pretty good controls internally for managing a lot of that stuff, and we don't really have any reason to doubt what's happening. So the workforce side tends to be, the way in which it's approached from a strategy perspective tends to be different to the customer side. I could talk about that for hours, but it gives you some idea of how you need to think about these things for sure.
And Dave, in the FSI space, certainly Haventec has seen a kind of an explosion of interest in this topic. Are there any clients who've kind of jumped on this that stand out to you in terms of their journey to date?
Well, I did mention in my last response 86400. Launched a couple of years ago here in the Australian marketplace. And they are a client of ours, but they're a great example of an organisation who, certainly in our opinion, have thought about the entire experience from the onboarding process of new customers all the way through to their ongoing interaction with their brand and with the services they're offering. I did mention they've been handsomely rewarded with market-leading customer satisfaction scores that are materially above the rest of the marketplace. And while those scores are about the entire experience, a lot of the research that's been done that's publicly available around 86400 have highlighted some areas where, in actual fact, security and privacy can enhance the overall digital experience. Now, the 86400 come up with a way of taking an anonymous digital identity through generating a new digital identity through KYC and transacting on their banking application in under 2 minutes. I think you'd argue that any bank in the Australian market, or for that place globally, would have a similar ambition to be able to acquire customers and confidently onboard them into their banking environment in under 2 minutes. Once a customer is onboarded, every time they turn back up to the digital application to use the service, they quite simply either hand off to the biometric reader on their device or put in a 4-digit PIN in the instance where maybe the biometric device is not available for them. They may have a mask on. That's it. And under the covers, we complete a one-time use multi-factor authentication, and once we've digitally identified them, we throw away all of the keys. We create a new set of keys ready for the next time they sign in. What's also interesting with that solution is that if 86400 is ever compromised by a breach, the perpetrators, if they get in, there is nothing of value to steal, because we do not centrally store that information in a form that can be stolen.
Thank you, Dave. And Mark, just returning to you, there's Microsoft have invested in some augmentation of their platform, the E5 platform, in order to assist their customers with this journey. Have you seen any trends in terms of the types of organizations that are getting ahead of this, and what experience or what outcomes they're seeing?
Yeah, so there's probably 2 reasons folks really approach it. Number one is, they're either approaching it because they see it as an answer to the security problem that we've already outlined earlier. Others are seeing it as part of their digital transformation journey. And when we talk about digital transformation these days, we're not just talking about the business and the outward-facing services you offer to your clients, but the experience from a user perspective. Again, sort of going back to that point we were making earlier around, we sort of expect it on our own devices. Why can't we have it in the workplace? So they tend to be the drivers that if you're doing a modern rollout, you're rolling out modern systems, modern operating system, modern desktop, modern cloud-based services, etc., then moving away from something like passwords is normally on a lot of folks' agendas. And again, I think there was another point that was mentioned earlier. There was one client that I think we will at some point be releasing a case study on, but can't talk about right now, where one of their primary drivers was the accessibility component of it, where moving away from having to use the traditional approaches for typing in passwords to making it more accessible as a technology. Those that do implement passwordless and do have a stronger satisfaction from an employee perspective, normally because it also comes with newer devices as well, which I think is a side point on it. But even just talking from my own experience, you know, I can't tell you the last time I typed a password in from a work perspective. It's been my face for the past couple of years, and I couldn't even tell you what my password was. I actually can't even remember what it was. It's got to that point now. So from a user perspective, for me, you know, I've moved way beyond passwords in my professional life. Now they still persist quite strongly in my personal life from a point of view of all the various apps and so forth I end up using from a you know, a personal perspective, whether that's my bank or any other service that I'm consuming.
Thank you, Mark. At this point, I think it's timely for us to have a pause and ask ourselves a question. So we have a poll that we would like you all to have a look at and respond to. So keep an eye on your screen. Why is passwordless authentication important to your business? We're making the assumption that it is because you're here listening to us today. You can select as many of the following as possible. So stopping credential theft and phishing, improving adoption across your digital channels, keeping up with the competition, improving the user authentication experience, or reducing costs, all of which we've touched on so far. So take a minute just to respond to that poll, and we will come back to the results a little bit later. Great, I can see the responses coming in. Thank you so much for your participation. I'll just give a few more seconds for you to complete. Okay. I think the responses have stopped. That's great. Thank you to everyone who participated. There'll be one more poll just before the end of the session today as well. I'm going to move on to taking these trends and these concepts and thinking about the practicalities of going on a passwordless journey. So we've heard why. For those of you who've maybe thought, yes, I get the why and I can see the business imperative, let's have a think about the how. You know, what should you as a leader consider before this implementation journey? And Dave, I might start with you with some introductory thoughts on this.
Thanks, Stephen. Look, I'm going to start with what would arguably be the obvious, but give you a bit of an insight into some things to think about as you start to progress this from maybe an idea to a bit more of an action plan. In our experience with the clients that we've worked with to date, it's as much about a journey for the technology team as it is for the exec and the customers that business is servicing. What is interesting in all of the cases for the organizations that we've worked with is they've started this journey with the customer and their privacy at the core of the reason why they're ultimately embarking on the journey. So we know customers want simple, convenient, accessible, privacy enhancing digital experiences. So when you're going through the process of identifying a solution partner in this space, seek out solutions that are, that provide you with the opportunity maybe to differentiate from the start. Imagine if you could allow your customers to ultimately use an authentication solution or an authentication means that they were most comfortable with. So We often hear when we're introducing ourselves to new organizations, our customers are used to multi-factor authentication. They want to keep that. Fantastic. If that is the case, look for a solution that allows that experience to be left into the marketplace. But if you've got other customers that want to use biometrics, if you've got other customers that want to use a simple password, if you've got other customers that want to use a complex password, look for a solution that allows you to do that. So differentiate it from the moment they authenticate, but do that in a way that ultimately addresses the privacy point. So regardless of the solution that's implemented, that if the enterprise is ever breached, and regardless of the way you're bringing a customer in, ensure their personal information can't be stolen. We know that centrally stored data, including usernames and passwords, is vulnerable to breach. So seek out decentralized authentication solutions so that prepare you for when your enterprise is breached, so that if anyone does get in, or what's unfortunately more often than not, that when somebody does get in, there is ultimately nothing of value to steal. And while you've still got obligations to your regulators from a reporting perspective, if as a consequence of the breach and a consequence of the solution that you've put in, no sensitive information has been stolen, it is an easier conversation with your regulator. You also want to make it easy for customers to access, or we know it's making it easy for your customers to access your digital services is great for business. And picking up on a point that Mark raised around accessibility, seek out solution components that drive adoption, that improve the customer experience, and that ultimately make your digital service accessible to the entire marketplace. We know that if you are going to, from the get-go, when you're digitally or when you're authenticating your customer, if you're going to drive friction in at that moment, you are going to have an impact on adoption, and that adoption and the drop-off in adoptions, more often than not, going to have a negative impact on your broader business case. And then finally, we know customer expectations are moving fast. And in this day and age, a good idea on the other side of the planet can be in our market within a week. So focus on password solutions and a time to market consistent with the speed with which you want to remain relevant to your customers. More often than not, access to a password solution, certainly like passwordless solutions, certainly like ours, does not require a wholesale digital transformation or a wholesale replacement of your existing identity and access management layer. Look for solutions that can easily integrate into your existing applications or your identity and access management solutions. This ultimately gives you the ability to reduce your time to market, and at the same time, it puts you in a great spot to improve your responsiveness to your customers' expectations. And I would also argue it puts you in a great spot to respond to the speed with which your competition is moving as well.
Thank you, Dave. So we'll summarize some of these points in some material that we'll share after the webinar for all attendees. John, if I might turn to you, there was a question that was asked earlier that I think it's kind of timely to think about, which is, there are passwordless offerings out there, and one of our attendees used the word confusing around those and what is viable. I wondered if you could give a perspective from Deloitte's digital identity practice on the passwordless options that are there and the things that are important to you when you're advising and giving good advice to clients.
Yeah, sure. Happy to do that. I think one of the things, I touched on this before, but I'll cover it again. So it's very important to understand the audience that you're targeting. I think there's people tend to conflate whether it's customer or workforce, or in the case of universities, students and other sorts of communities that you're supporting. Understanding their needs and what you're trying to achieve is really important. So the tendency is that people go off and they do a a tech eval, effectively just ticking off a bunch of technical functional specifications against an often kind of concocted list of requirements, and then they'll do some research on pricing and some other bits and pieces. What we often do is to encourage them to think about what problem they're actually trying to solve, and to look at what offerings in the market would be best for their community. And that changes things quite a bit, because it's not just a tech eval at that point or a pricing evaluation. It's really about, so what is the best thing for this community? And you might end up with different solutions depending on the target audience that you have as well. That's kind of an important thing. The other thing that we often talk about in terms of vendor selection, Australia is similar to markets overseas for sure, the US and the EU. We use similar product sets here to the ones overseas. The challenge is though that you can end up seeing a lot of good materials, say, coming out of the US, and find that they don't have, that particular vendor might not have much local support here. They might not have expertise. They might not have had a particularly large community of practitioners, for example. This is certainly important for some of the larger deployments, not so much on the Authenticator side, but for larger identity management projects. So we certainly encourage our clients to think about the other dimensions to the problem and the problem they're actually trying to solve. The other thing is to do, a lot of people do proof of concepts, and they often target the wrong things. They often try and figure out whether or not the tech does what the tech says on the tin, which you can almost guarantee it does what it says on the tin, rather than look to figure out whether or not the proof of concept can meet the client's, the target audience's needs, and what the response is. So I think, there's a lot of design thinking stuff out there these days. It's been around for a very long time, but that notion of doing that empathy mapping, understanding, putting yourself in the shoes of the user base and their experience, and just testing that with smaller pilots, I think is very important. The other things don't go away. I mean, the tech eval piece is obviously important, and the pricing is important. So I'm not saying dispense with that entirely, but also don't forget the other dimensions to the selection process.
Yeah, I think that conversations that I've been having with CIOs and CISOs around this suggest that opening a horizon that's a little bit further along is important. We mentioned 86400 earlier. If 86400 had set their sights on internet banking as the kind of target sector, they would not have made the growth and the progress that they did in such a short time. So that horizon setting is critical. Mark, for Microsoft, it seems, from my perspective, looking at where you guys are going, that the solutions that you have are really focusing in on employees, that B2E side of the equation. What should leaders thinking about their employees and their experience bring to bear?
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. There was a really good point just made by John a moment that I wanted to pick up on, which was it was about evaluating your workforce, right? I think naturally we just tend to think of our workforce, our people sat in front of computers every day doing, some form of administrative task. But actually, when you think about it, organizations vary. Some are very field staff heavy. They could be very much more mobile phone or tablet orientated versus laptop versus maybe some are very desktop. And then, also scenarios where you've got where individuals own their own computer or are assigned their own computer. Like, me as an employee of Microsoft, I have a laptop. I don't share it with anybody. It is my laptop. But if you think about some organizations, think maybe doctors and nurses in a hospital, they would move between terminals and stations in a hospital. So what does their experience look like, and how does that differ? So can they use biometrics, or have they got to revert to some form of key, or like FIDO key, YubiKey type scenario, or have they got to do something different? So it is ultimately about understanding what works for your environment, and not one solution fits absolutely everything. I think the second one that I just wanted to add on top of that as well is I think it's one of the biggest challenges we find is helping people understand more about what passwordless means, because I think passwords are really easy to understand. as the comment we made right at the start, they've been around 6 decades. We all get it. The idea that you type something in that only, you know, in air quotes, only you should know, and that then lets you in. The idea that you don't have a password and you're relying on something else, I think adds a little bit of a scare factor to some individuals, because passwords are easy to understand when you move into the world of keys and crypto and all the technologies that tend to underpin passwordless offerings. It starts to get quite scary for some quite quickly. I know I've ended up in debates with customers where we've just talked even just about things like biometrics, where they pulled out some stat that says, oh, but look here, the false acceptance rate on this facial recognition is 1 in X hundreds of millions. It's like, I'm pretty sure your the ability to crack the password is way easier than that false accept, that very edge case of false acceptance rate on that one particular device. So there's probably a lot of education to be done as to what do passwordless offerings mean, and the fact that they strengthen the authentication in your environment, that they don't weaken it. So that's probably my two that I'd push out.
Thanks, Mark. And Dave, just returning to you to round this topic off before we open out to our poll again. There's a lot of offerings are continuing to pop up into the market, and we've had a question around something that we've touched on earlier, but maybe it's worth just expanding on again. Team members or executives who argue that the passwords are ubiquitous and that they're fine. This is definitely an education as well as a business imperative situation. So, any final thoughts, having listened to John and to Mark, on how to get started with your passwordless journey?
Well, beyond some of the things I've shared, I think there's enough data, whether it's on what customers want, what customers like, how effective current architectures and current technology are at protecting sensitive information, and what we as a citizen or consumer expect as it relates to the handling of sensitive personal information about ourselves. And I think if you just look at the data set, you sort of go, okay, well, relying on what we've got access to at the moment as a means of driving the next wave of our digital transformation, it doesn't feel like it's a great idea unless you're ultimately addressing the things that the data is telling us. I was actually thinking on the other side of this question, what if you can get it right? I'm certainly one of the things for me personally is I would then have the ability to stop listening to my mother complaining about how difficult it is to access her banking environment. She asked me to explain, why do they send me an SMS? And I said, well, Mum, how this conversation goes is you turn up at your bank's digital front door, and the first question they ask is, who are you? And you put in a username and a password. And sort of from a conversational perspective, the next thing they say to you is, I don't believe you, so I'm going to send you something else. And I said, that's essentially the digital conversation that this organization's having with you. And so what if you could drive the next wave of transformation on with access to technology solutions that provided you and the business that you work for the confidence that you knew at the first moment that you're dealing with a customer, they were or they are who they say they are. I think it opens, and we think it opens, a whole world of new possibilities for organizations to take more advantage of the reach with which the digital ecosystem affords. We strongly believe that the future of open government and the open enterprise is going to be heavily dependent on the existence of trust. And initiatives and ideas like passwordless authentication built on decentralized identity providers are one of the key foundations that's going to really start to open up this broader and the next wave of growth as it relates to organizations taking additional advantage of the digital reach we have. I would also argue the opposite, that if we don't, especially as more immutable data sets are used by organizations, if we don't figure out a means by which we can ultimately protect this information, we're going to continue to see ongoing breaches of privacy, and arguably, be in a position to minimise that, to put further friction between a customer and a business offering a digital service. So, in actual fact, I'm really excited about the opportunity ahead, but I do think that we're going to be able to take more advantage of that if we're addressing some of the foundational components that we're building all of these new digital experiences on. And I can take less support calls from my mother.
Thanks, Dave. So a quick shout out or call out to attendees. If you have any questions, please pop them in the chat now. We should have a few minutes to get to those, if any come through after the second and final poll, which will appear on your screens any second now. Hopefully. There we go. So our second and final poll is, when choosing a passwordless solution, what factors are most important to your decision? And please select the top 3 from time to deploy / ease of enterprise integration, ease of use by the end user. We've covered accessibility extensively here. Change management, for example, migrating of users maybe from a legacy system. Compliance with relevant standards, FIDO, OIDC, or cost savings. So take a second to select what would be the 3 most important out of that group of 5 for you when choosing a passwordless solution to embark on your journey. Time to deploy, ease of use, change management, compliance, or cost. Okay, I will give a couple of seconds to. All right, I think we'll publish the outcomes of those polls in a few seconds. We're at the end of the webinar, and we'll share the information as well. A question has come through for the panel. Can you please maybe list out some of the available passwordless options that are in the market? I know, John, if that might be one that you might be able to have to start us on.
Put me in the hot seat. I'm in danger of mentioning vendor names, which I'm not really meant to do in the public. I think that's the challenge.
Well, I understand the challenge that presents. Maybe some of the password options.
I mean, there's if you look at a lot of these things have come out of existing communities on the authentication side. So if you look at historically, I guess ForgeRock was mentioned earlier. I think Dave mentioned ForgeRock. So a lot of these authentication platforms support a whole community of authenticators. You just need to look at those products, whether it's ForgeRock, Ping, Okta, the main vendors in that space. They do have offerings themselves, but they tend to support a community, that kind of live and breathe this stuff. So all the way through to the older kind of Semantic had a bunch of stuff in this space. There's things like YubiKey that was mentioned earlier. Duo is one of them. There's a whole range of them. All the usual suspects pretty much kind of have some offering in this space or creating offerings. I don't know in terms of how you'd find the best ones for yourself. We would usually kind of do a market scan and tailor it to the target audience that you're looking to address, for sure. And usually you want to have a look at the products that you have today and what authenticators they would support as well, and what the integration looks like. So it's not a great answer necessarily, but there's certainly a lot of players out there today. I think the other question which has been touched on before is, when you say passwordless, what do you really mean there? There are plenty of people who still have solutions where the password sits behind the scenes, sometimes with a just very thin veneer on a mobile app that replays stuff. Sometimes more sophisticated solutions, FIDO solutions or the Haventec solution that you guys have. So it's important to kind of understand what your actual requirement is before you embark on trying to pick one of those technologies as well, because there is a sliding scale of people who put their hand up. It's the same problem with things like zero trust. Every man and his dog kind of jumps on the bandwagon, so you'll find a lot of stuff that's not really passwordless necessarily, but might serve your needs. I don't know if that helps. I was just going to add to Dave's comment as well around his tech support for his family. I'm sure the whole audience is aware of the website, Have I Been Pawned? It's quite interesting to type in your email address. I've done that with my family, and they're usually horrified as to how many different organizations have spilled their credentials. I use a password app myself, which generates very large, complicated passwords. I've just done it again now. There are 4 on the list. I won't tell you who they are, but they're well-known organizations. So I've got a constant battle to go and change my password with a whole bunch of providers that I use. So yeah, give it a go. I think it'll be interesting to see, in reality for yourself or your family members, especially your kids, your mother-in-law or whoever, how much of their stuff has been spilled on the dark web.
There's a question that's come through around identity proofing in a passwordless world. I'm not sure we'll have time to cover that. If anyone wants to quickly answer that, or we might move to the polls, I'll leave it for Dave or Mark. Okay, we might come back to that one in and send out some information. So Mark, final question before we just reveal the poll and close the webinar. How do enterprises approach the cultural issues around moving to passwordless? There's been a lot of conversation about the importance of passwords, and now they're going to be removed. What are the first steps toward educating our workforce and our customers around the benefits of this?
I think to a certain degree, there's probably not a hell of a lot of convincing for folks to do if they're already using them in their personal lives. Going back to I think right at the start, we started to have this conversation around, most of us on our mobile phones or our tablets at home are using, some form of biometric style capability, which gives that passwordless, if you like, approach, so that we're not used to having to type in long, complex passwords on our mobile phone to get into it, and same on our on our iPad or Android device or whatever it is that we use. So I think from that perspective, it's not like we're trying to introduce a new style of technology into the enterprise that nobody's ever seen before. I think going back to that point that I made right near the start on how we've approached it internally within Microsoft is that we've tried to, the first thing is to just try and reduce the amount of times anybody ever gets to see putting a password in. You've almost got to try and make that an alien concept. So if you live in an environment like now in a enterprise environment where you haven't really sorted out your enterprise single sign-on, and folks are having to type their passwords in 4 and 5 times a day as they move between different systems, number one is to eliminate that style of environment such that folks are getting to the point where they can move seamlessly without having to put their password in, and then move to the environment where you can actually remove those things altogether, like logging into their PC is done in a seamless manner such that they don't put their password in, and they're used to not then having to type their password in from that point on. I think it'd be difficult to find somebody who is a strong advocate of saying, no, I really love all those prompts, and therefore culturally we've got to keep them from that perspective. So I don't think you get massive amount of pushback. I know from my perspective, and internally within Microsoft, we embraced it big time. As I say, it's now become alien for anybody to have to type a password in, which is your ultimate goal.
Thank you, Mark. So we're coming up to the hour. We might run just a couple of minutes over. Mikhail, I think it'd be good to pull the poll results up just to see if we've got any comments on those. So let's see. the passwordless authentication. Why is password authentication important? Improving the experience is the standout there of 90% of our attendees believe that that's a critical component, closely followed by stopping credential theft and phishing, and then it's pretty close between adoption and reducing costs. So that's really interesting. We'll make sure that this gets shared with you all. Maybe Dave, any thoughts on that outcome?
Well, look, it's. I mean, it hasn't popped up anything that that was unexpected. Certainly, in the conversations that we're having with our the organisations that we're partnering with, the customer experience piece is key. They're doing this to improve the relevance, adoption, take up of their digital service. So it's nice to see that one's out the front. But and recognizing that if you're going to change the means by which you're authenticating your customers, doing that in a way, doing that on foundations that can't ultimately get breached, because putting in passwordless, but then doing that on foundations that still require the storage of a username and password somewhere. I think my take from that second point is that looking for solutions that do both of these things feels like it's important to the attendees on the webinar.
Which is highly important to our. Those are the really the foundations of the Haventec business. Improving experience and eliminating the risk of phishing and theft. So that's really important feedback for us. And the second poll, let's have a look at what it tells us. So when choosing a password solution, what factors are most important? We have a tie. Time to deploy and ease of use. Some corollaries there between the first poll, and then in second place, almost a tie between change, compliance, and cost. So we can tell that all of these are important, but the ease of migration and the ease of use can ties in very closely to the accessibility piece that was highlighted in the first poll. With that, we're a little bit over. I am going to call an end to this Haventec webinar. We would like to thank you for attending today's session. Please help us create better webinars by completing the survey at the end of this session and letting us know what other topics you would like us to cover. Everyone will receive a copy of the recording via email later this week. So thank you all for attending. I hope you got some value out of today, and have a great day. Thank you.